Okay, so we're taking notes today. So I will I'll email you each of these papers. So video people, you will get it. Fill in your name, your date. The topic is the Renaissance today, and the subject is history. That's the class that we're teaching. So you'll fill it in as we go, and we'll see how that works. All right. Get my notes together here. Okay, where are my notes? My notes are over here. Okay, so the first thing we're going to be talking about the Renaissance, and we'll be looking at a timeline of the Renaissance as well. I know you all have studied this before. This isn't new material for both of you, for many of you. So hopefully we'll get some new stuff out there. One of the first things I want to talk about in the Renaissance, we've kind of come through the Middle Ages now, and people have moved off of the manor. You know, they lived around with a lord, and they lived around a castle where they could go for protection. Many people have moved off the manor now and have moved into towns, and towns are like a thing that in the 1300s, that where people began to live in towns as opposed to out in the countryside. As population grows after the Dark Ages, and there are enough people to actually have towns again. And so one of the things you need in town, if you have merchants, if you have people who trade, you need a bank. Always, if I write it, you should write it on your notes, so you know. So yeah, we're talking about the Renaissance, so everybody knows how to spell it. Make sure that's getting on the video. Of course it's not. There we go. Now it'll be on the video. And like I said, people are living in towns. They're off the manor. And we're looking at this point, late 1300s, right before the beginning of the Renaissance. And one of the things you need in towns are banks. Because now people are merchants in town, they're stable, they're settled, and they need a way to deal with trade situations. They need a way to pay for expeditions to go out on trade. So you need to have loans, which we need banks for loans. We also need banks to keep money safe. And they were originally set up in towns, and in Italy, and the Italian word for bench is banca. It means a bench, and that's what they would do. They would set up, a place where they could lay out a piece of wood and call that their bench, their banca, and they would deal with people and their money. They would exchange money from foreign countries for local money. They would make loans to people who want to go out and trade, and they need what's called capital money. Just I have some cash to go take out and pay for these goods to bring them back and then sell them at a profit, right? So these bankers are doing all these different kinds of things. And in Florence, Italy particularly, but also in a couple of other cities like Genoa, we have a particular family that becomes really the founding family of banking. And their name is the Medicis. And the Medicis are the first kind of big bank, M-E-D-I-C-I''S. And so the Medicis, they would produce coinage, gold coins generally, because at this point in history we have a way of testing gold for purity. It's called a touchstone, and gold is a great way to store value, because gold it doesn't tarnish, it's hard to find, and it's soft enough to make into jewelry, so people value it. So it's a good source of storing value. So if you bring me in grain of a certain weight, I will give you gold of a certain weight. Obviously, it takes a lot of grain to get a small amount of gold, but the idea is now we have a standard coinage for the first time. Get rid of some of this other stuff now. So standard coinage comes up right before the beginning of the Renaissance, which of course all of this banking activity will lead into the wealth and the prosperity that people have that allow the Renaissance to flourish. Wealth and prosperity. Prosperity would be a good word to like stop at the PROSP period. Make your own abbreviation. Make it a little easier to take your notes. I know I'm always in the way. So they also begin to give out what's called a bill of exchange. And a bill of exchange is basically a piece of paper that you have that say, I'm storing my money with you. You are going to hold my money for me, and I have this paper from the Bank of the Medicis, which everybody knows now because they're famous, that I have this much money in your bank, which means that I can go abroad without carrying gold with me, and I can go to a trader and say, this is how much money the Medicis are holding for me, and I can use that bill of exchange like money. I can say, you can take this bill of exchange for me, and when one of your people is in Italy, they can go and get the cash. They can go get the gold coins that it's worth. So it becomes kind of the first paper money, if you will, these representative certificates that the Medicis are giving that allow people to travel all over with kind of a guaranteed amount of money sitting there in the bank. So like I said, so you get this idea that they're called banknotes. And we even still call money, sometimes paper money, banknotes. And so this is where it begins, back right before the beginning of the Renaissance in the late 1300s. So I'm going to pull out a timeline, and I want y'all to get together at one table as a group, which we'll kind of surreptitiously video so that like nobody has to have their faces seen because it's terrifying apparently. And they can at least hear your discussion, okay? All right, so what I want you to do is I want you to talk to each other about, I know about this, I learned about this, I know what this is. Come over here, y'all. So, sorry. If you want to put two on this side, Julie, that might be easier for discussion. All right. All right, I'm going to move the video now. Okay, all that you can see are people's hands, okay? But you got to talk loud enough for them to hear you. Okay, so go through the list one at a time and say, I've never heard of this before, or yeah, I learned about this and this, or I know about this and this is what I know. Okay, so you can take some notes on what people share with you. Does that make sense? So who wants to be the person that starts at the top and says, what about this one? Somebody be the moderator here besides me. Okay, I nominate Carter. So just start at the top.
So, like 13, 14, the Renaissance develops?
Then start with the next one.
Okay.
And if anybody knows anything about it, tell people.
Okay.
If not,
1305,
Giotto.
Giotto
He's
completes his
Italian.
work on the
Scrovani.
Scrovani Chapel in
Padua. Oh,
Words
sorry.
suck.
Maybe I should just do it. So you don't have to. Okay. So does anybody know about any of these things about Giotto, about this chapel that he worked in, or the town of Padua?
Negative.
No.
Nobody. Okay. So put a big question mark next to that one. Okay. The next one is Dante writes his epic poem, The Divine Comedy. Anybody know anything about that? Have you heard of it before?
Not
Have you
really.
heard of Dante?
Heard of his name, but
Heard
not
of his name,
anything.
okay. We know he was back around the 1300s, right? Anybody know anything about the Divine Comedy?
I've heard it. I don't really
You've
know.
heard of it, okay? So let's put like a minus sign next to that, right? So like we want to learn some more about that. I should probably do it on my paper so I know what I want to teach you. What we want to go over. What do you want to take notes on? Okay, 1341, the first great humanist Petrarch is named the Poet Laureate of Rome. Anything on there sound familiar to you? Make any sense to you? Anybody heard of Petrarch? No, you can say no if you haven't heard of it. That's not your fault. It means no one's taught. See, this wasn't in the mystery of history. See, that's what I have to figure out. What did people learn in the mystery of history and not? Okay, do you know what a poet laureate is?
It's a poet.
Good. A poet laureate is basically chosen by the local government, or in our case, we don't even have one for our country. basically saying this is the poet that represents our nation for a particular period of time. In this case, it's Rome. It's the city of Rome. He's like the greatest poet in Rome at this time. That's what that means. Okay, the architect Brunelleschi designs the dome for the Florence Cathedral. Ever heard of him?
Yes.
Yes.
Ish.
Ish? You've heard of him? Ish?
I've heard more about the cathedral than I did him.
And what have you heard about the cathedral?
Just like, I
That it's there in Florence?
can't, yeah, like,
Good answer, good answer.
sort of, like,
Okay, we're up to 1431 now. We're all the way into the 1400s now. And the Medici family becomes the head of the city-state of Florence. Well, you know something about them. Like, what else do you know about them besides this? Hello?
they like started coins.
Right, bankers.
Yeah.
They were the first bankers of Florence.
So what should we mark there if we?
You can make that a dash, okay? And the whole idea of a city-state. Have we talked about that this year, about city-states?
At the very beginning of the
Do
year.
you remember what that means?
It's a city within a state.
It's actually a city that functions as a state. Even though it's just a city, it's like
It has its own
its
laws.
own government, right? It has its own laws, its own government, separate from any other, say in this case, in Italy. They may be in Italy or in a particular part of Italy, but they function as a state. Singapore in Malaysia is a
What?
city-state.
Oh.
Okay, just an example, not
I
not,
was like,
not
what
of the
is it?
Italian resident. In our world now, it is just a city, but it functions as a state on an island. Okay? Okay, I know you must know something about the next one. 1405, Johannes Gutenberg invents the printing press. And where did he do that?
Oh, I don't know where.
You don't know what country it was? Or what country it would become, actually?
England.
Germany.
Dang it.
Look at his name, Johannes Gutenberg.
Oh, yeah,
So,
that
yeah,
doesn't
he's
make
from
sense.
Germany.
Finish.
And what was the first thing he printed?
Bibles.
Bibles. Good. See, y'all can put it like a check mark next to that one. You know about that one. Okay, 1453, the Ottoman Empire captures the city of Constantinople, signaling the end to the Byzantine Empire. So we've kind of talked a lot about Constantinople, right? Whose city was that?
Constantine.
Constantine. And we know about the Byzantine Empire, right? That's the eastern part of the Roman Empire. Anyone know where the Ottoman Empire is based out of? What country?
Turks.
The Turks. So what country?
Turkey.
Turkey. I think y'all can give the check mark on that one too. All right. 1469. This is one of the Medici people, Lorenzo de' Medici. Just means Lorenzo of Medici. That's his family. He becomes head of the city-state. Again, there's that term of Florence, and he is one of the great patrons of the arts. Have any of you ever heard of Lorenzo de' Medici before? Outside of my talking about the Medici family.
In the book.
In the book. Very good. Okay, give that one a dash. Because you already know something about it. 1485, Henry VII becomes the King of England, beginning the reign of the House of Tudor. Any of that mean anything to you?
Yes.
It sounds familiar.
Sounds familiar? What do you think, Julie? You said yeah?
We learned about it in like history of history.
You learned it in History of History? Okay, then give that one a dash. Botticelli completes the painting of the birth of Venus. Any previous information on that one? Okay, let's give it a question mark then. All right, I think the next one, I'm hoping we can give it a check mark.
I have no idea who this person is.
1492, explorer Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas.
He's a painter.
He's a painter.
I'm pretty sure it was the
Actually,
last
I don't know if you
settler.
remember, but it was actually a Viking that was the first European on the North American continent. I remember
Leif
who that was.
Erikson.
Leif Erikson got there first. But so we'll give Cristobal, which is what his actual name was, a check mark. So, and then we are going to get into stuff that you know a lot about.
Painter.
So I just want you to take a minute before we really talk about it and give your check minus or question mark about those things. So if you already know everything about Da Vinci and the Last Supper, you can give it a check. And all the way down to the bottom of the page. Oh, there's something missing on that Raphael.
Yeah, I
So
was
just
like,
put I don't know what happened there, just put a question mark, because I need to look it up.
I was like,
Unless you happen to know everything about Raphael and can name it. Name that painting in 2 letters.
The great something.
And then you can turn over when everybody's ready. Do the same thing with the rest of this. We've talked a little bit about the age of exploration already. All right, can you put your name on it when you're done and turn it into me so that I can, this is like my research. So we don't go over things that you've already learned there were 5 other times in history classes, and you already know it perfectly. All right, so we'll go back to our seats and take some more notes, or you can stay in those seats, I don't care. Whatever makes you comfortable, but I'm gonna come back over here with this. All right. All right, so we're gonna take some notes. If anybody fills up their paper, I have lots of extras. Maybe I should just put some out there for you. Here we go.
Wait,
Actually, you can just write on the back. What?
didn't we already do that?
Yeah, we're continuing.
Oh, okay.
We're continuing.
I was like,
Wait, what? Okay, continuing with note taking. All right, so the Renaissance is obviously, you know about it. It's a period of history that is very fruitful, especially in terms of arts. I need to not have this pen in my hand. I'm gonna write on the board with it. So the arts, political philosophy, exploration, religious reformation, okay, we're going to stick with those 4 to start with. Obviously, arts during the Renaissance, you see now, Julie? Okay. Were huge. We have some of the greatest art of all history produced during this period. We have a community of artists working together. They know a lot of them know each other. They encourage each other. So you have this amazing art community going on in Italy, mostly to begin with. We have the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance begins first, and then a little later on we get the English Renaissance in England. So there's kind of 2 phases. You start with Italy, and then a little later we get, we'll just call it Britain, because it kind of covers all of Great Britain. Okay. It's pretty much the 14th to the 17th century. That means the 1300s to the 1600s, right? Because it's always one back in counting the years. And we get some of the greatest thinkers and authors, statesmen. Oh, the one thing I forgot to put up here is science. We have huge advances in science during this time. And they're all thriving in this era, along with global exploration of new lands and cultures. And so we really bridge the gap between the Middle Ages and modern civilization with this period of the Renaissance. So it's the gap, the bridge between those things. So we know during the Middle Ages, we've already learned this, that we have the fall of ancient Rome, and all the way up to the 14th century. We don't have much advancement in science or art or politics, and it's known as the Dark Ages. As we've talked about, it was a time of a lot of war, the plague that wiped out so much of the population. Most people were illiterate. They couldn't read or write. If they even had anything to read, they couldn't read it. There aren't a lot of books out there. They generally don't write. They're just trying to survive. Because not only do you have the plague, you also have some times of famine when it's what they call the Little Ice Age during the Dark Ages. I don't know if we talked about that. During the Little Ice Age, the temperature was relatively cooler, it was rainier, and so harvests were not good during this period. And when there's not enough food, that leads to famine, people starving. So we're getting past this Dark Ages era.
Wait, is it called Little Age or Little Ice Age?
Oh, thank you, Carter. It is definitely the Little Ice Age. What happens when you're trying to go fast? Haste makes waste, okay? Now, in some parts, you know, that whole idea of the Dark Ages is a little exaggerated. Some parts of the world were not in such dire shape. But basically, we're looking at largely Western Europe was really struggling during this time. And so since a lot of history comes right out of Western Europe, that's why it gets focused on that. But there was not a lot of paying attention to education and ancient Greek and Roman, you know, the classic age, all those things that they knew. People weren't paying attention to that during the so-called Dark Ages. So this is a time when people get interested again. Okay, the Viking Age is kind of settled down, so people aren't in constant fear of their life, and they can invest in things like education and learning and reading. So we see a growth in education and reading and literacy, actually learning to read. And of course, what invention really pushes forward this reading and literacy business? The printing press, exactly. The printing press makes a huge impact. Now people actually have things to read. And in fact, the most common things printed originally were not books. They were either pamphlets or leaflets. So either, you know, just a little single sheet that you could hand out. It might have political philosophy on it. It might have, you know, this is happening at this place on this day. And then pamphlets, a lot of political pamphlets, little short books, like maybe 4 or 5 pages, that you could sell them for a penny, and people could read as they learn to read. And then we move forward into eventually more books being printed as more people learn to read, and more people learn to read and write. So people want something to read. So that becomes, for originally Bibles, lots and lots of Bibles were printed because people, in Latin, generally, it's very controversial to print in English. And actually people are burned at the stake for printing Bibles in English. So that moves forward a little bit later on, more in the 1500s, that they get freedom to have the Bible. Well, when good old King James comes along and says, okay, I'll pay for that. I'll pay for that English translation. So, so the cultural movement during this time is called humanism. Okay, and for our note-taking practice, notice I wrote it big and I underlined it. If you can't see and you want to move, that's okay. Like, if you could see better over here or at the ends of the tables, I don't know how to get out of the way of that board and still do the video and all that. I'll have to work on that. All right, so humanism begins to gain momentum in Italy, right? And it gets the idea that each man has importance in and of himself. The individual, each individual has importance. Prior to this, people were more often kind of grouped with their family or their clan or who they served. And now the kind of this recognition that, you know, each person can be kind of the center of their own world. And people can embrace the idea of personal achievement. I personally can learn to read. I personally can learn to write. I can create art. I can study science. Okay, so the individual becomes more important. And then we have, with the printing press, right, we also have advances in communication. If you saw one of the videos that we saw, if you were here last Thursday, we saw a video that talked about there was very little communication between villages even. People didn't know from, they were isolated because it was terrifying to be out on the roads. You just didn't know what might happen to you. So now with the printing press and with relative peace in Europe, then people are able to communicate better with each other. They can send a letter. They can, because it's safe to be on the roads, they can share a pamphlet that they've read. They can send it over to their cousin 2 towns over, somebody traveling that way. So as people communicate with each other, ideas spread, okay? That's really important, the spread of ideas. Because you bring me an idea, and I have an idea, and it's kind of like I tell 2 friends and you tell 2 friends, and pretty soon we all are working on the same idea. And isn't it interesting? And what about this? And what about that? The other thing is the rediscovery. Now that, I don't know if you can see this way down here, but the rediscovery of the classics. All the stuff from ancient Greece and Rome that was not pillaged by Vikings and was hidden away in the monasteries, up far away in the mountains and in the deserts. There was actually a great monastery built out in the desert outside of Palestine because they wanted it to be hidden away where nobody could find it. It's still, the monastery itself is still there, but so they can go, and the monks have protected a lot of this ancient knowledge, ancient even to them, and so they're reading these authors from Greece and Rome and opening up their minds with these ideas. And we get people like that guy I mentioned before, Petrarch. Francesco Petrarch is a humanist author. Petrarch writes on humanism. And his work is distributed. It's spread out to the masses. And of course, we do have the growth in banking. So international finance and trade improves culture, and it improves what people are eating. And so they're healthier. Healthy people have more time for ideas and reading and thoughts and learning. So the Renaissance basically starts in Florence, in Italy. Generally, if you ask people who are very well traveled around the world and you say, what's the most beautiful city in the world? A lot of them will say Florence. And a lot of that is because of all the art that is still there, that blossomed during this time. And members of the Medici family, we've already talked about, they actually ruled in Florence for 60 years, a little more than 60 years, and they were great supporters of the arts and sciences. And so they were willing to finance it. They were willing to pay artists. They were willing to put their own money on the line to have beautiful buildings built and beautiful artworks, right? So we have great Italian writers and artists and politicians that are all part of this kind of intellectual and cultural revolution. So let's talk about some of these Renaissance geniuses, right? We have all these people in the Renaissance that we look back in history and are kind of amazed at who they are and what they did. And first, the Italians come first, and we have people like Leonardo da Vinci, right? Painter, right? We know he's a painter. We know that he painted the Mona Lisa, one of the most famous paintings in the world. But he was also other things than that. He was also an architect. He was an inventor. He actually drew up the first known drawings in history of a helicopter. Can you imagine? He didn't have the engine technology to make it go, but the design was a workable design. He just couldn't make the engine yet because we didn't have that kind of metallurgy yet. So he's really the first man to be called a Renaissance man. And a Renaissance man is, of course, you know, this idea that he's knowledgeable and proficient in a lot of different areas. So I just want to talk for a minute about some of the most famous Renaissance men of history, right? So we have Da Vinci, we have Michelangelo, another one, who was an architect and a painter and a sculptor and a poet and a writer, right? All of these things. But we can move forward in history and see out of the Renaissance and into the 1700s even, and we see people like Benjamin Franklin was definitely a Renaissance man. He was into science, right? Literature, politics. He was an inventor. Social justice and civil activism were important to him. He was a diplomat. He was an author, political theorist, all these things. So definitely a Renaissance man. For sure, Galileo was a Renaissance man, right? Astronomy, but also math, physics, philosophy, music, art, all of those things. Thomas Jefferson, another Renaissance man, right? He was involved with architecture again. He was an author. He was a lawyer. He was a musician. He was a botanist. There are actually plants that grow out at Monticello, his home, that were brought by him from Europe. And they grow there at Monticello, even though they're not indigenous to our country. He brought them here because he wanted people to know. He was obviously a political theorist and a philosopher. He wrote our Declaration of Independence, though he himself did not free his own slaves. We know that he advocated for freedom for all men. That comes from where? Where does he advocate that freedom comes from? From your government? Is that where your freedom comes from? Where does freedom come from? We the people in order from by their creator. He said, you have inherent rights given to you by your creator that do not come from government. They do not come from men. They come from the creator that made you. Every human being has rights. Okay? The interesting thing about Thomas Jefferson, this has nothing really to do with the Renaissance, but he actually wanted to free some of his slaves, but there was a problem with that because in Virginia at that time, you could not be a person of African descent and live in Virginia as a free person. The law at that time meant all of those people would have had to leave the state of Virginia. And Jefferson didn't quite know how to manage that situation and free his slaves at the same time, though slavery always troubled him, and he wrote about how it troubled him, even though he also had a somewhat negative view of people of African American descent, as everybody did at that period of time. So Thomas Jefferson is a mixed bag of all of these things. Another one of the great, amazing human beings, I'm a fan of the Renaissance, is Sir Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton was one of the greatest scientists, physicists, can you see, of his time ever. He was a
Did he discover the laws of gravity?
He explained the laws of gravity for the first time and did the math and did it right. Right? I discovered this concept and I'm going to show you how it works with math because all science and math are interconnected, right? So, mathematician, physicist, astronomer. He wrote about theology. He was also an alchemist. Do you know what an alchemist is? Alchemists were big business in the Renaissance. The idea of alchemy is that you can take what they call a base metal, so like tin or something that isn't worth a lot, and you can do chemical processes on it and turn it into gold or silver.
Yeah, that was like the big thing. They kept on trying to make gold
Right.
from alchemy, but they couldn't.
They never could. Doesn't work. Alchemy does not work. But Isaac Newton tried to do a lot of these different things, these processes, to see if they would work, to see if they would take base metal and turn it into valuable metal. There's a very famous mathematician, which you may or may not have heard of. It depends on if you've ever done computer programming. His name was Blaise Pascal. If you were a theology student, you would also know about him because he was a very famous theologian, but if you've ever studied computer programming, one of the programming languages is named after him. It's called Pascal, because he was a great mathematician back in the day when people were just basically beginning to figure out what math was about again. I mean, they knew back in ancient Greece, but a lot of that was lost. So I want to think a bit about if you could think of anyone who we would call a Renaissance man in modern times. Someone who can do it all. How about someone like Pharrell? Pharrell Williams, right? He's a musician. He's a producer. He's an event planner. He is a television personality. So he has all these different pieces, okay? Many actors that we know of also have a lot of other interests besides that, which would make them Renaissance men. Or someone like Bono, who's the lead singer for U2, is very involved in things outside of music, social justice, poverty issues, these kinds of things. He's an advocate for those kinds of things. But so like we talk about the Renaissance men, what about the Renaissance women? Weren't there any Renaissance women?
They didn't have like rights back then.
They did not have rights. That's exactly right. They had zero political rights. They were actually legally required to do what their husband told them to do. They had no freedom. Basically, the one role of almost every woman during the Renaissance, other than the royalty. If you were royalty, you didn't have to take care of the house. But every other woman, that was her job. Her primary role was to run the home. Now, she might also be, if she's a peasant woman, she might be out in the field helping her husband, but she's also supposed to run the home, okay? Your husband might be a shop owner, middle class, shop owner or a merchant. So she's helping run the business and running her home, right? And but then even though the women of the highest class who had servants, right, they didn't have to run their home. They had to run their servants. They had to organize their household with their servants. But basically they still were always subject to either their husband or their father and their decisions. And actually a woman was not allowed to live independently. If she didn't marry, she couldn't live like alone on her own. That was basically against the law almost everywhere. So she either had to live in a male relative's house or join a convent. Those were her choices. You can go live in the Society of Women, or you can go live with your brother or your uncle or your father. Those were your options. There were a few, just a couple that I could really find outside of Queens. Queens did a lot of stuff. And very wealthy women often wrote music and those kinds of things. But there was a woman named Lucretia Borgia, who was actually the daughter of the Pope, because popes were not celibate like they are now. They had families and children. And she was actually kind of a political pawn for her father, the Pope. And he married her off numerous times based on his political ambitions. He would give her divorces when he wanted her to marry someone else. But along the way, she managed to learn a lot and be very savvy. And she actually helped some of these husbands start a business. And so she was the behind the scenes person. She was very, very smart. She was actually kind of stuck with a very bad reputation because she had somewhere between 5 and 7 husbands, none of which she chose. Like I said, her father would just marry her off to the people that would be politically advantageous for him. But she managed to still, even through this kind of exploitation of her life, managed to do a lot all on her own. And then her sister-in-law, one of her sisters-in-law, her name was Isabel d'Este, which is D''E'', was one of the most intelligent women of the Renaissance period. She mastered both Greek and Latin. She memorized whole books by the ancient scholars, and she would give public performances, either of public speaking, like reading these books that she'd memorized, or she would also sing and dance and play musical instruments. And she was married to the Duke of Mantua. Mantua is a city in Italy. And apparently they had a long and happy, loving relationship. And she had a great deal of influence within the royal court there in her city, and actually became known as being a woman of artistic genius and being very elegant and being very witty. So she had this great reputation, and so her husband, the Duke, he becomes the Duke, and the Duke was the ruler in these city-states in Italy. He was captured in battle, and she stepped up to rule Mantua herself. So she influenced the economics of the region. She developed the textile and clothing industry that became kind of the cornerstone of their economy. She collected paintings and sculptures and musical instruments and written manuscripts from the artists of the area. So even though the theme of life for most Renaissance women was basically being subject to someone, these two women are exceptions to the rule. And so I want you to think about women that you can think of today that you might call a Renaissance woman in modern times, because women have lots of opportunities now. Can you think of a woman that is successful in more than one area of her life? Just think about it. She might be an artist, she might be a politician, she might be an author. I'll tell you one. Any of you ever heard of Condoleezza Rice? Condoleezza Rice was the Secretary of State, meaning in charge of all of the foreign affairs for our government under President George W. Bush. But she is also a master scholar with more than one PhD from Stanford, and she is an award-winning concert pianist. So she does all of these things, like overachievers, right? Right. And many of the women in the arts are often entrepreneurs on their own. Besides, maybe if they're a musician, they might have a clothing line. They might produce their own records. They might produce other people's records. Many of them are politically active. Okay, so I want you to just think about that over the next. What's today? Today's Monday, right? Until Thursday, think about that. And we'll talk some about the Renaissance women. And so I will see you then. Don't lose your notes.